There is a line in the Gospel of Philip that almost no one alive today has ever heard, not because it was misunderstood or ignored, but because it was hunted, deliberately removed, erased word by word across the manuscripts the moment the early church realized what it meant. In the scattered fragments that survived, scholars noticed a break, a torn sentence that refers to three objects, three physical, tangible objects, that Jesus told only his inner circle to carry. Not icons, not charms, not metaphors, tools that were described as operating on a frequency Archons could not penetrate. The missing line speaks of things made by hands that carry the light of the plural realms, objects designed not for worship but for protection. They were meant to shield, to veil, to make the chosen ones invisible to the forces that fed on fear, confusion, and spiritual exhaustion. This was knowledge meant for the few, but when the institutions realized what these objects could do, the passage was torn away. And tonight, you walk into the story they tried to bury. The reason these references were erased was not theological disagreement or an attempt to avoid confusion. It was control. Because if ordinary people could protect themselves directly, if they could access the frequency Jesus taught without priests, without confession, without fear, then the entire structure of intercession collapsed. Imagine a world where spiritual defense didn't require permission. Imagine a world where exorcisms were unnecessary because the moment one carried these objects, interference broke instantly. No ritual, no hierarchy, no middleman, just the individual and the frequency they carried. What would be left for the institution to govern? The idea that salvation and protection could come from within, strengthened by tools anyone could hold, was a threat they could not allow to live. So they tracked down copies of the Gospel of Philip. They edited versions. They destroyed manuscripts. And yet, like all forbidden knowledge, fragments survived inside Gnostic communities who were willing to suffer and hide and run to keep the memory alive. Those Gnostics understood something the church feared, that spiritual conflict is not symbolic, not poetic, but vibrational. Frequency is not merely sound, it is state, signature, resonance. Everything that lives emits it, and everything that feeds on life seeks lower ranges of vibration, the heavy, dense fields where fear and despair thrive. The Archons described in Gnostic literature are not demons in the sense of medieval imagery. They are parasitic intelligences that operate beneath a specific vibrational threshold. They cannot rise higher, they cannot maintain form where consciousness expands, so they rely on suppressing human frequency. And Jesus, according to the suppressed passage, gave his inner circle three items, three frequency anchors, not rituals, not prayers, objects that could broadcast a vibration strong enough to collapse the field of interference the moment they were held. When these anchors were carried, testimonies written by the Gnostics describe something that echoes through time. Mental pressure breaking like glass, intrusive thoughts silenced instantly, a sensation like stepping out of a heavy fog. Not gradually, not over hours, instantly. Because frequency isn't about belief, it's about resonance. And certain materials by their very nature hold patterns that are older than doctrine, older than civilization, older than the concept of religion itself. The first of these objects was a stone, but calling it a stone is like calling a temple a building. Lapis lazuli, the deep, celestial blue mineral that ancient Egypt called the stone of heaven. The same stone the Sumerians associated with the gods, with divine vision, with the very fabric of the unseen realms. Jesus taught that this stone wasn't magic. It wasn't superstition. Its power came from the crystalline matrix that encoded a frequency aligned with Sophia's spark, the divine consciousness descending as sapphire fire into the world. The Gnostics believed the universe was layered in tones, and that lapis lazuli contained one of the purest tones of the higher realm. Not because it was pretty, but because its structure vibrates at a frequency incompatible with Archonic interference. When Jesus placed this stone in the hands of his students, it wasn't to decorate them. He used it to restore what the texts called true vision. the ability to perceive without manipulation. Gnostic writings say that Archons do not simply attack, they distort. They twist perception, influence thought patterns, and create an inner fog. But when lapis lazuli is carried near the body, especially over the chest or between the palms, the disturbance weakens as if its signal cannot survive the resonance the stone produces. This was the first object because without vision, without clarity, none of the other tools mattered. Across civilizations, lapis lazuli appears not as jewelry but as a teacher. Egyptians placed it over the brow to open the inner sight. Sumerians carved their gods' eyes from it to symbolize unfiltered perception. The Gnostics used it in initiation rituals to demonstrate how quickly oppressive thought forms dissolved in its presence. You can imagine the shock of the early church when they realized people could protect their minds with a stone rather than a priest. You can imagine why they burned the texts. Because when a person learns that a mineral from the earth can hold a frequency aligned with divine consciousness, the gatekeepers lose their monopoly on protection. The Gnostic fragment that survived describes the moment Jesus handed the stone to one of his disciples. It says, "He placed in his hand the sapphire fire and the mist parted." This was not metaphor. This was the beginning of a technology that did not look like technology. It looked simple, it looked harmless, but its effects were undeniable. People reported dreams becoming vivid and clear, anxiety fading, night terrors stopping altogether, a sense of being watched evaporating. The presence of intrusive thoughts dissolving like smoke. For the Gnostics, lapis lazuli wasn't a crystal. It was a device that tuned the mind back to its natural frequency. And for the institution trying to build power, that was unacceptable. The reason Archons focus so relentlessly on the third eye is simple. That center, along with the crown above it, forms the gateway between ordinary perception and higher perception. When those gates are open, the human being is no longer trapped inside the narrow field of the five senses. They begin seeing energy, intention, and influence that normally hides beneath the surface of physical life. For Archons, whose entire survival depends on operating in the shadows, this is death. And so they target those centers constantly, through energetic interference that feels like pressure in the forehead, sudden confusion, or numbing fatigue, and through physical interference that ages and calcifies the pineal gland until it no longer vibrates. They attack because if humans ever truly saw them, even for a moment, their old advantage would disappear forever. This is where lapis lazuli becomes something far beyond a stone. Ancient mystics understood that its frequency matches the electromagnetic resonance of an uncalcified pineal gland. When held close to the body, especially near the forehead or heart, the stone doesn't add something new. It reminds the pineal gland of its original state. The resonance creates a harmonic field around the brain, and slowly, the natural ability to perceive begins reawakening. People have described it as suddenly stepping out of a fog they didn't even know they were in. Perception sharpens. Synchronicities begin appearing with uncanny precision. Dreams become vivid, structured, and prophetic. And in quiet moments, you start sensing subtle presences, benevolent ones and parasitic ones, because the blindfold is coming off. Archons fear lapis lazuli for a reason older than religion. Once you see them, they lose their only weapon, invisibility. The moment you can tell which thoughts are yours and which thoughts are invasive, the manipulation collapses. You begin sensing when something is siphoning your energy. You notice the chords. You recognize the emotional triggers that were never actually yours. And because you finally understand the source, you begin rejecting it. A conscious rejection is the one thing an Archon cannot withstand. They rely on stealth. They rely on the human mind believing every thought belongs to itself. Once that illusion cracks, the game ends. This is why the instructions for using lapis lazuli were passed secretly from one Gnostic to another. Always carry the stone. Wear it as a pendant if possible, or keep it in your pocket so its field remains close to your energy centers. Touch it often. Let your body tune to its resonance. 30 days of daily contact begins rewiring perception permanently, because once the inner sight awakens, it does not close again. People who struggle with blocked intuition, people who feel spiritually blind, people who cannot sense when something is wrong or when something is watching, this was the object meant for them. But the second object Jesus taught had nothing to do with sight. It had to do with identity. And this, more than anything, threatened the powers that later rewrote spiritual history. In the Gospel of Philip, there is a line about the hidden name, a name not spoken in public but known only to those who understood the nature of the divine source. This teaching was misunderstood for centuries because people assumed Jesus was speaking of his own name. But in the surviving fragments, the hidden name points not to a person but to the monad, the source consciousness from which all spirits originate. The name wasn't a word, it was a vibration. Jesus taught that writing the sacred identity is more powerful than speaking it. Spoken words fade. They echo for a moment and dissolve, but writing creates a physical anchor of frequency. Paper and ink become carriers of standing waves that continue broadcasting long after the hand has lifted. A written declaration of origin ripples into the non-physical just as strongly as sound, but it lasts far longer. And Archons, who depend on identity confusion to influence a mind, cannot withstand the presence of a being who remembers where they came from. This is why the second object was simply this: a clean piece of unused paper, and the words written slowly, deliberately in permanent ink, I am monad. Then the paper is folded 3 times. The first fold seals intention. The second fold seals identity. The third fold seals the energetic signature that announces your return to your true frequency. That small folded paper is carried on the body at all times, inside a pocket, a wallet, a bag, anywhere the skin or clothing touches it. The moment it is activated, people describe the shift as unmistakable. Mental fog dissolves. Confusion stops. The internal chaos that Archons use as a doorway to step inside the mind closes. Thought clarity returns within hours. And something unexpected happens. Attacks through people stop. Not because the people change, but because the Archons that use them as portals can no longer attach to someone radiating identity consciousness. The written name acts like a frequency-based restraining order that echoes into every realm. This being is aware. This being cannot be harvested. This being remembers. There was a third object, and this one was not for the person but for the space around them. Jesus taught that the world is shaped by frequency, and that geometry is the language through which divine patterns enter the physical realm. In the Gospel of Philip, it says that truth does not come to the world naked. It comes through images and types. Meaning, symbols are not decoration. They are vessels that hold frequency. And the simplest of these, the one early Gnostics used more than any other, was the monad circle, a single, hand-drawn circle representing infinite consciousness, with a solid dot in the center representing the divine spark within every being. When this symbol is drawn intentionally by hand, its frequency activates immediately. It does not require ritual. It does not require belief. The geometry itself does the work. A clean sheet of paper, ink, and a steady hand are enough. The circle represents everything. The dot represents you, the spark of source consciousness placed inside the infinite. Drawing it is an act of alignment. Placing it near the bed, on the wall, inside a room, or in a spiritual space changes the atmosphere in ways people feel instantly. The air becomes lighter. The room feels calm. Dreams shift from chaotic fragments into structured journeys. Heavy presences dissolve. Intrusive energies cannot enter the space. Early Gnostic communities drew these circles in doorways, temples, hidden rooms, and the walls of sanctuaries. They created frequency zones Archons could not cross. When these 3 objects are used together, something extraordinary happens. They form a system not of belief but of resonance. Lapis lazuli restores sight. The written name restores identity. The circle restores the purity of the surrounding field. One works on perception. One works on consciousness. one works on space. Together, they create a human being who is energetically unreachable, someone outside the frequency range Archons can manipulate. These are not rituals, they are technology. Ancient technology disguised as simple objects, hidden in plain sight. And this is exactly why the church buried every trace of them. The early leaders understood that the moment people could protect themselves without priests, the institution's power would collapse, dependency would vanish, their authority over fear, sin, and salvation would evaporate. Worse, these objects made people immune to the lower entities the church secretly relied on to maintain influence. If the chosen ones could free themselves, the gatekeepers lose their gates. So the manuscripts were burned, the symbols erased, the teachings declared heresy. Anything that made humans inaccessible to Archons was destroyed. But the memory survived, and now, for the first time in a long time, the knowledge rises again. You might wonder which of the three you need right now. The answer depends on your struggle. If your intuition feels blocked, if you cannot sense what's true and what's false, if you feel blind inside your own life, then you begin with lapis lazuli. If your mind feels foggy, if confusion follows you, if you cannot tell which thoughts are yours and which thoughts feel intrusive, then you begin with the written name. If your home feels heavy at night, if your room disturbs you, if you feel watched when you sleep or drained when you wake, then the monad circle is the object that shifts everything. Most people know immediately which one calls to them. And once you choose, once you activate even one of these ancient tools, the shift begins. Archons lose access instantly, not someday, not after long practice, immediately, because you rise into a frequency they cannot enter. This is the knowledge that was forbidden, hunted, erased by the institutions that feared what would happen if humanity remembered its own power. But remembering is exactly what you're doing right now.